This is the maiden voyage of the Savvy Skeptic Psychedelic Forum. This is our first episode called This Mortal Coil. And let's take a moment to talk about what we want to achieve with this initiative.
Let's do that, Katya. It's good to be with you. And hello, listeners. Pleasure to be with you. You can see from our very topic, we are addressing the savvy skeptic when it comes to talking about psychedelics. Katya, as you know, there's a whole bunch of conversation happening in this world about psychedelics, and many in our profession, many of us who are scientists and clinicians, there's this skepticism about what is this all about. So you and I are taking upon ourselves to look at data, important publications and data with a keen eye, with a skeptic's eye, and let the listener decide for themselves what they want to think about it. Does that sound about what your goals are too?
Yeah, that's well put. I think a lot of people are curious about psychedelics, and I think they want to know what is all the buzz about. And I think that we can approach it with a very agnostic, evidence-based philosophy, present the data, and as you said, people can make up their own minds with the information.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that today we could start by talking about Roland Griffiths' 2016 paper on using psilocybin to address anxiety and depression in people who are terminally ill and have fear of death related to that. And I'm interested in this topic because I think that there's nothing more human in a way than fear of your own mortality, and perhaps people who are terminally ill and the acuteness of that fear, there's something very elemental about it. And if you have something that can address one of humankind's greatest challenges, then that's probably something very powerful. What do you think?
Yeah, you picked a very wise paper from a very wise man. So the third renaissance of the psychedelic research, as some of us call the last 7-8 years, was launched by this paper. This paper that Katya and I are going to discuss, which appeared in the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology with Roland Griffiths as the first author from Johns Hopkins, was actually the paper that got all of us talking about it because the study was conducted so well. But coming back to the point you had raised, nothing is more elemental. I'll agree with you about this fear that we naturally possess that sometimes becomes unnaturally large and leads to not just a poor death for the individual, but for those who survive. And it was Roland Griffiths' desire to study it that led to this amazing study from Johns Hopkins that got all of us thinking about new ways of looking at psychedelics.
So this wasn't the first paper to study that, right? There was an earlier paper, I believe, in 2011. What do you think sets this paper apart from that?
Yes, so that was Charles Grab's paper 2011 in the Archives of General Psychiatry. But Katya, the truth is, even that wasn't the first paper. As I look at the literature, there are not dozens, several dozen papers from the 1960s and 70s that looked at LSD primarily, but also psilocybin, looking at exactly this issue. So this concern that we've had about people dying poorly is centuries old. But in more modern terms, yeah, Charles Grab's paper in 2011 was the harbinger, was the forerunner of things to come. The problem with the Grab paper was it was only 12 people. That's a challenge. And it was not well blinded. It was not well blinded. As a result, biasing is a large issue in psychedelic research. So the Grab paper did alert the field. There's a big signal potentially, but we need a better study. And that's where the Roland Griffiths paper and the study is just so profoundly important.
So one of the things that struck me about the Griffiths paper is that it was so exquisitely well constructed. And the expectancy effects that you mentioned were definitely controlled. And I thought maybe we could talk about what are some of the innovations in this research. From my perspective, I thought it was really very thorough, that it investigated not just the patient's perspective, but clinician and community ratings, both at the time of the treatment and 6 months down the line. So it was really like a 360-degree view of the person's experience across time.
Wow, Katya, you summarized the overarching aim of this paper, which was to shoot for the stars. There wasn't an element that is relevant that wasn't studied. So let me lay out a few of the items from that paper that my colleagues and your colleagues would want to know. For example, the dosing was much higher. So there was a low dose arm, which was 1 to 3 milligrams. There was a higher dose arm, which was 22 to 30 milligrams. But generally speaking, patients either got 1 milligram in the low arm or they got 22 milligrams. So that's the first innovation. There's no placebo. There's no placebo. So when you offer patients an informed consent, you don't have to say there's a placebo. You can just say you may get a high dose, you may get a low dose, you might get one before the other. That reduces the clinician and the patient's bias. And reducing bias, better clinical results. So study design was a crossover. Half the patients got low dose first, half the patients got high dose first, and then they were intersected. And I do think the fact that this research group of solid, middle of the road clinicians and researchers actually used the mystical experiences questionnaire to study if that was an important mediator of effect was radically different. Because even now, I'll speak for my profession, Katya, which is psychiatry and mental health. We feel a bit squeamish talking about things that in culture we don't feel squeamish talking about God and unity and connection and purpose and oneness. But this paper actually looked at it.
I think that's very interesting, and I think it was very bold to use it. The other thing that I find really inspiring is the mediator analysis, which to me really says that this is not just another factor that correlates with something, that predicts something. Mediator analysis really says that the score on the mystical experiences questionnaire is an essential part of the outcomes that they saw. So it's not just another treatment that happens to correlate with something. It's not random. This is a key part. The mystical experience itself was a key part of their findings.
What you said is key, and I hope our listeners are leaning in to really listen to you closely. So psilocybin is a chemical entity. We know that. We know psilocybin is a powerful 5-HT2A agonist. Okay, we know that. But what is new in this paper is that wasn't in itself, the data shows, that wasn't in itself the primary driver of improvement. The primary driver was what was occasioned by this 5-HT2A agonist. And your articulation of what got occasioned is exactly on target. It is that mystical experience that is radically occasioned, rapidly. It's not weeks later, it's 60 minutes later, 90 minutes later, that leads to a profound restructuring of the person's relationship with their story, restructuring of their relationship with their own past challenges and future challenges. And clearly, as the data shows, you alluded to it, their interaction with family and community also changed in such a way that the ultimate effect was an antidepressant, anxiolytic effect that didn't occur just for the short term, but for as long as 6 months. So have I, based on your reading, have I in essence captured what you found to be true from this paper?
Absolutely. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the findings and how many patients were in remission versus response, because in psychiatry, that if you were studying any other substance, that's what you would be asking. So did it work?
Yes.
Did it solve the problem of anxiety and depression related to imminent mortality for these patients?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And there's no conflict between a person experiencing mystical experiences and those of us who are of a scientific frame of mind. If we are the savvy skeptic, we also want to look at data. So let me share with you some of the prominent findings from this paper. So, for example, HAMD, Hamilton Depression Inventory, 84% of patients had a clinical response with the higher dose. 84%. That's 5 out of 6. 68% actually went into remission, being defined as 7 or less on the HAMD. I hope that fact is not lost on our clinical colleagues. Also, that was just after the second dose. But in terms of 6 months later on HAMD, 6 months later, remember they've had no other treatments besides these two that we just talked about, 71%, which is more than 2 out of 3 patients were actually in remission. And these were patients who knew death was coming. By the way, HAMA, anxiety, that is a common challenge for these patients. 80%, so 4 out of 5 patients actually had a response, which is at least a 50% reduction in their symptoms. 60% of patients were in remission with the higher dose first and the second treatment. And in terms of what happens 6 months out with only those 2 treatments, 63% of patients were actually in remission. But that's not it. That's extremely intriguing and almost unheard of, Katya, but there was more to it. In this study, they actually talked to the family members without telling the family members why they're talking. They didn't betray the trust of the patient that the patient has used a psychedelic. And I looked, just like you did, on the community ratings of change in terms of just an attitude towards society and community and families. And that not only improved, it was noted at 6 months to be a significantly positive thing. And then finally, I'll add one more thing that'll make even the most skeptical of the savvy skeptics perhaps pause and think this out for themselves. Majority of patients rated their psychedelic experience, particularly on the high dose, as one of the top 5 most personally and spiritually meaningful experiences. And that is a fact that shouldn't be lost on anyone, skeptic or not. But let me invite you to offer some thoughts.
I think that's very well put. And I would say that that's probably the part of the paper that stood out the most to me. Because when people talk about the most meaningful experiences of their lives, they're talking about the birth of their child or their child taking their first steps or graduating from college or getting married. So this experience with a substance and the inner state that it elicited was right up there with those life-defining experiences. And that is very dramatic.
Really well said, Katya. There's something about psychedelic therapy. The chemical entity of psilocybin really does bring us face to face with our own reality that we often have forgotten. So it's not like you all of a sudden fall in love with a life that you never had or that's entirely fictional. It is the life you already had. But somehow it's almost like a cleaning of the windshield, which looks like life seems to do that. And psychedelics apparently do that. Now, the question, perhaps many of my colleagues will say, that sounds too touchy-feely. That sounds too shamanistic. That doesn't even sound like psychiatry. But I wonder, Katya, if it's time to, based on the findings from this paper, for psychiatry to accept that inner wisdom derived with the help of a 5-HT2A agonist is as real and as true to the person who experiences it as perhaps someone who receives it just after, say, 10 years of meditation in a Buddhist retreat or 20 years of a psychoanalytic psychotherapy.
Absolutely. And I think that those of us who, like you, work in psychiatry or like me, write about psychiatry, we believe that the mind and brain are the same thing. And nowhere is this as evident as in this research. But I will ask you, on behalf of the skeptics that we are addressing, what about the safety? That is something that when people are first starting to find out about psychedelics, that is something that concerns people the most. Is this safe? Is it scary? What happens to people? So what was the safety tolerability experience like in this study?
It's a very fair question. And I personally agree with anyone, skeptic or not, that safety ought to be front and center, if not preceding anything else. So let's look at the study's safety profile. And please be assured, the Griffiths approach to psychopharmacology research is one of, I wouldn't say almost excruciating detail, but I would say deep detail in looking at side effects. So let's talk about that. First of all, there were dose-related increases in heart rate and blood pressure that they reported, but they were transient. They were transient. Not one patient at the end of the 7 hour, which is the duration of the visit 1, visit 2, when they're getting low dose or high dose, not one patient had persistent effects. Not one person had persistent psychosis. Not one person died in this trial because of suicide. Not one person had a myocardial infarction or anything of that sort. So I can assure you of that. At least the data here assures us that the safety is actually pretty impressive. There was nausea and vomiting, 15% of patients, which is 1 out of 6 had that. There was dose-related increases in physical and psychological discomfort. But when it happened, it still happened in a third or less of patients. And the most importantly, remember, they were transient. Mm-hmm. And this is why, Katya, offering these therapies with a trusted, experienced, and licensed clinician actually is important. But one more time, let me state emphatically, there were no cases of persistent psychosis or hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. But having said that, there were persistent cases of improvement in wellness, an improvement in depression, an improvement in anxiety, an improvement in family interactions, even out to 6 months.
That is fascinating. So just to make sure I've got this straight, what you're saying is that the side effects basically were transient and limited to treatment. And as soon as the treatment was done, they resolved and there were no long-lasting, serious negative consequences. However, the positive consequences lasted as long as the follow-up happened, which was 6 months. And they were not just in terms of the point of view of the patient, they also came from the clinician and the informant, the family member or the caregiver, who I believe you said didn't even know why they were being interviewed. They just knew that the person they were caring for was somehow changed, better, or had a more positive outlook. So the positive lasted and the negative did not. Is that a fair summary?
Very much so. In fact, may I take it one step further? The Griffiths group went and met these patients years after the 6 months were over. Now, today, because of time, we won't discuss that paper. But that meeting that happened again between the researchers and these very participants happened years later. And this is what they found: the benefits on anxiety, the benefits on depression, but also the benefits of how they viewed their impending death, which, by the way, all of us have impending death. It's just that patients with cancer perhaps are more face-to-face with it. They persistently saw that improve. So for a psychopharmacologist, this is radically new way of looking at things, because we were trained psychopharmacology only works when the drug is there. But psilocybin's half-life is such that within 2 to 4 days, pharmacologically, there is no detectable psilocybin in your blood. How do we then explain this? We will have to use a different lens. And that's why our conversation with the savvy skeptic is, you may have to adopt a different lens to understand how this pharmacologic agent produces such long and persistent changes in elements of human mind that are very important to us.
Well, Rakesh, thank you so much for summarizing this. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I'm really looking forward to talking about the neurobiology of some of these effects and how something so transient can have such long-lasting positive effects in the coming weeks. So thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you to all of our listeners for being here and taking part in it.